In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to valleys that time seems to have abandoned, where even the birds fall silent at certain hours and dogs refuse to cross certain thresholds, there exists a documented case that has puzzled historians for nearly 2 centuries. The locals still call it the Hollow Reckoning. They do not discuss it willingly. In 1834, the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow communities so isolated that maps of the area bear lie acknowledge its existence. What happened during their 3-day stay was meticulously recorded in the personal journal of Pastor William Phillips, a document discovered in 1987 when the old church was finally demolished. Workers reported that the demolition crew refused to finish the job after the 3rd day. 2 of them never spoke about what they found in the walls. One of them drank himself to death within a year. Pastor Phillips's journal entries describe events so precise, so unnaturally accurate, that modern psychologists have studied them with a kind of desperate urgency not to understand the Morrison twins, but to explain them away. None have succeeded. The Morrison twins didn't just predict future events. They revealed secrets buried for decades, described people they'd never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred years before their birth. They carried the smell of wood smoke into rooms without fireplaces. Their shadows, witnesses claimed, sometimes move a half-second behind their bodies. One congregant, old Mrs. Garrett, wrote in her own diary that the twins' eyes would sometimes go completely still, not blinking, not moving while their mouths went on speaking. As if, she wrote, something else was using them like a pair of gloves. Every single detail they revealed proved to be absolutely, verifiably true. The Kentucky of 1834 was a land caught between wilderness and civilization, where communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual isolation among the Cumberland foothills. This particular settlement had been established in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom, or so the story went. The truth, as the Morrison twins would reveal, was considerably darker. The founders hadn't fled persecution. They had fled investigation. By the time the Morrisons arrived, Pine Hollow consisted of barely 200 souls, most related by blood or marriage, all bound by the strict Baptist doctrine that governed every aspect of their daily lives. The community center ran a modest wooden church built with their own hands using timber from the surrounding hills. What no one spoke of was the smell that sometimes rose from the church floor on hot summer days, a sweetish, cloying rot that the congregation had learned to breathe through their mouths and never name aloud. Pastor William Phillips had been at Pine Hollow for 5 years. He was a learned man, thoughtful and kind, who had abandoned a comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls. He maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and significant community events. He was meticulous. He was observant. He had noticed the smell from the floor. He had noticed the way Elder Thompson's hand trembled whenever anyone asked about the church's founding. He had filed these observations carefully in the back of his mind, in that dark drawer where we store things we aren't ready to know. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar figure along the circuit of remote churches scattered throughout the Appalachian region. Tall and weathered, with prematurely gray hair that spoke of hardships, Tiant is 34 years. He traveled on foot with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather satchel. He had been widowed for 9 years ever since his wife Sarah died giving birth to the twins during a terrible winter storm that isolated their cabin for weeks. He'd had to deliver the girls himself. He'd had to dig his wife's grave himself, in frozen ground, with his bare hands wrapped in strips torn from his own coat. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were striking in their identical appearance, yet completely different in temperament. Rebecca was outgoing, magnetic, possessed of a smile that made adults feel seen and children feel safe. Rachel was quiet. Rachel watched. Those who looked closely noticed that she often began sentences that Rebecca would finish, but more than that, Rachel would sometimes answer questions that hadn't been asked yet. She would hand someone a handkerchief before they began to cry. She would move away from a doorway seconds before someone came through it. The journey to Pine Hollow had been particularly difficult. Late autumn rains had turned the mountain paths into treacherous mud, and Ezekiel had been forced to carry Rachel for the final 5 miles when she developed a fever. That fever was the third in as many months. Each time the fever broke, the girl's knowledge seemed to deepen, to expand, as if illness was burning away whatever membranes separated them from something vast and cold and very old. They arrived at sunset on November 15, 1834. Ezekiel would later write in his own journal, "God forgive me. I should have kept walking." That first evening, as the family shared a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked about the roses by the eastern fence, the ones that had nearly died from blight 3 summers ago. Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon. The rose blight had not been discussed outside the immediate community. When pressed, Rebecca smiled and said she had dreamed about roses while walking. She did not mention that in the dream, the roses had been growing up through something buried beneath them. She did not mention that their roots were dark with something that was not soul. Pastor Phillips recorded the incident in his journal that evening. He described feeling inexplicably uneasy, careful, ministerial language. What he did not write, what he crossed out and then wrote again and then crossed out more thoroughly, was his first impression when the twins had walked through his door, the sensation that they were not entirely alone, that something was following them, not behind them, but inside them, looking out through their eyes with infinite, patient hunger. He was a rational man. He crossed it out. The next morning, Rebecca told him about the whiskey bottle. She knew it was under the 3rd floorboard from the altar. She knew it was wrapped in a blue baby blanket, the blanket that would have belonged to his son, dead 5 years. She knew about the child's death. She knew about the way Phillips sometimes lay awake at 3 in the morning whispering apologies to a small grave in the eastern corner of the churchyard. Philip sank into his chair. His hands would not stop shaking. He asked how. Rebecca's expression shifted into something that had no business on a 9-year-old face. Not cruelty. Not innocence. Something between the look of someone who has carried a truth for so long that they've forgotten it was ever a burden. She shows us things, Rebecca said. Faith Whitman. She shows us everything. Faith Whitman is dead, Philip said. Rachel stepped out of the shadows behind her sister. Yes, she said softly. That's why she has so much time. Sunday's service would be remembered by every member of the Pine Hollow congregation for the rest of their lives, those who had lives left to live. Ezekiel's sermon was powerful, but unremarkable. It was what happened afterward that tore the community open like a seam giving way under too much weight. One by one, the twins moved through the congregation. They spoke quietly, with childlike directness, as if simply noting obvious facts. To Samuel Turner they spoke of the church funds he'd been skimming for 6 months. To Martha Whitfield they spoke of her husband very much alive in Missouri and the letters she hid beneath the loose hearthstone. To Drive. Hayes they named patients he'd killed through ignorance and covered through silence. To the Miller family they named the son kept locked in the attic, the boy whose existence they'd erased from public record out of something they called shame and what was actually fear. Each revelation was delivered without cruelty, without drama. The twins might have been describing the weather. But what they said to Thomas Brett nearly caused him to faint. They described in precise detail his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, including a scar she had on her upper thigh that she'd told no one about, not even her husband. Brett swayed on his feet and clutched the pew. "How," he whispered. Rachel looked at him. "She doesn't know we know," she said. "Elizabeth. She doesn't know we know about the child either." She paused. "The one she lost in September." Brett made a sound that wasn't a word. He sat down heavily and did not stand again until the church had emptied. Then Rebecca walked to the front of the sanctuary, placed her hand on the wooden cross, and said the thing that cracked Pine Hollow's silence like an axe through ice. "This is sacred ground," she said. "But it's been stained by what happened here before. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire. They died right here, in this room. And some of you know exactly why." She did not look at Elder Thompson when she said it. Elder Thompson went white to his lips anyway. The Whitman tragedy was Pine Hollow's deepest wound, the kind that community stitched closed with lies and collective amnesia, and the unspoken agreement that some questions are not asked. In 1818, when Pine Hollow was barely 50 souls, the Whitman family had been among its most prominent. Jacob Whitman was blacksmith and unofficial leader, a man of principle so rigid it eventually became his death warrant. His wife Mary was known for her skill with herbal remedies and her gentle way with difficult births. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been 9 years old, the community's darlings, bright and beautiful, who sang in the church choir and helped their mother tend to the sick. The official story: the Whitman family perished in a tragic house fire during a winter storm. Their bodies were found in the ruins. They were buried with appropriate ceremony. The community mourned. Rebuilt, moved forward. The truth: Jacob Whitman had discovered that Pine Hollow's founders, men who presented themselves as God-fearing pilgrims, had financed their settlement through the systematic robbery and murder of travelers along the mountain trails. He had found, while shoeing horses, that some of those horses had belonged to men now missing. Men with families who were still writing letters to sheriffs in distant counties, still waiting for news, still setting a place at supper out of some terrible stubborn hope. Jacob had confronted the founders. He had given them an ultimatum. He had, in retrospect, completely misunderstood the kind of men he was dealing with, men who had killed a dozen strangers without apparent difficulty, men who had looked into the eyes of dying travelers and felt nothing but arithmetic. They followed the Whitman family to the church on the night of December 21, 1818. Jacob had brought his family here believing, as people desperately do, that a church would protect them, that murderers would stop at consecrated ground. They did not stop. Rebecca stood before the congregation and described the Whitman girls with the specificity of someone who had known them personally. Faith's birthmark on her left shoulder, Hope's silver locket with their mother's hair inside, Faith's blue Sunday dress, Hope in her nightgown because she had been ill with fever. She described the way Hope had called for her father, not understanding that her father was already dead in the next room. She described the way Faith had tried to cover her sister's eyes. She said this without flinching. Several members of the congregation were weeping. Elder Thompson was not. Elder Thompson had gone somewhere behind his eyes, to that particular internal place where old men go when the bill finally comes due. And then Rachel said the thing that changed everything. "Tell them about the babies," she said quietly. Not to the congregation. To Thompson directly. The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in Pine Hollow had ever heard. Mary Whitman had been 8 months pregnant when she died. Twins, the doctor had later confirmed in private, in the process of covering it up. To daughters who never drew a first breath, who died in the dark of a church built on stolen blood, their existence never recorded anywhere except in the memory of the men who killed them. 6 souls, not 4. The twins knew. Of course they knew. Thomas Brennan arrived the next morning, a solicitor from Lexington, representing the estate of Marcus Webb, one of the men murdered along the trail 17 years before. He had documents. He had questions. He had no idea what he was walking into. Rebecca told him about Webb's gold pocket watch before he mentioned it. The crack across the crystal. The initials inside. She told him exactly where it was, buried behind the church, 3 feet down, wrapped in oilskin, along with a leather money bag and a bridle from Webb's horse. Brennan ordered an excavation. Elder Thompson watched from a distance, his face the color of old ash. When the watch came out of the ground, tarnished, unmistakable, he did not look surprised. He looked relieved. like a man who has been waiting so long for judgment that its arrival feels almost like a mercy. Then the excavation moved inside the church. They found the first skeleton under the third pew from the altar. They found the second near the eastern wall. They found the third in pieces, mixed into the foundation mortar itself, as if whoever had put it there had wanted to make sure there was no separating the body from the building, as if they had wanted the church and the crime to become the same thing, permanently. Dr. Hayes, examining the remains with the methodical precision of a man trying to use professionalism as a shield against horror, confirmed what the twins had said. The bones were old. The manner of death, blade wounds to the ribs, fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, was consistent with violence. Not accident. Not exposure. He found the copper cross around the third skeleton's neck and had to step outside for a while. Judge Harrison arrived on the fourth day. He was skeptical of the twins until he wasn't. He interviewed them separately. He asked careful, legal questions designed to catch inconsistencies, to find the seam in a fabrication. There were no seams. Rebecca and Rachel described 11 murders with the calm detail of eyewitnesses' dates, methods, the names and physical descriptions of the victims, the locations of remains, the disposition of stolen property. When Mackenzie checked their account of Samuel Collins, the traveling preacher killed in September of 1819 against his own records, he found the description of Collins's horse was accurate to the last detail. A bay mare, white star on her forehead, a crack in the left rear shoe. When Harrison asked the girls to explain their abilities, Rachel said something he quoted in his final report, the passage that has been argued over in law journals and theological journals and psychological journals ever since. We see the echoes that tragedy leaves behind, especially when innocent blood is spilled in places meant to be holy. The ground remembers. We just know how to ask. Harrison stared at her for a long moment. How long have you been asking? He said, since we were born. Rachel said simply, we came into the world in a bad storm. Mama died. Papa says the wall between here and there was thin that night. The wall between here and where? Rachel looked at him with the patient, slightly pitying expression of someone explaining something obvious to a very slow student. There, she said. Where the dead go. Where they wait. Where they talk. Elder Thompson's confession consumed an entire day of court proceedings. He named names. He described methods. He traced the stolen money, every dollar of it, into the church, the school, the mill, the homes of founding families, who had never asked where the timber came from, who had never wondered why starving frontier settlements suddenly had more than enough. He wept through much of it. No one comforted him. What he could not explain, what none of the perpetrators could explain, was how two children born a decade after the last killing could know what they knew. Thompson had believed, with the desperate faith of a guilty man, that the dead were simply gone. That silence was the same as erasure. That enough time, enough prayer, enough Sunday mornings standing in the church built over the evidence, would eventually constitute forgiveness. I told myself, he said, his voice breaking into something that wasn't quite speech, that they couldn't follow us here. That the church was, I told myself, it was consecrated ground. Rebecca Morrison, seated quietly in the witness area, said nothing. But she looked at Thompson with those blue eyes that seemed to see 17 layers beneath the surface of everything, and Thompson flinched as if struck. They followed you everywhere, she said softly. They've always been here. You just stopped listening.
The sheriff's expanded investigation found 3 additional victims, more recent ones, killed within the last decade by men who had learned the techniques from their fathers the way other boys learned to shoe horses or cure meat. Knowledge, as Rebecca had said, does not die with its creator. It breeds. Pine Hollow was dissolved by court order. The church was dismantled plank by plank. Workers reported that the wood smelled wrong, not of rot, but of something older and sharper, like the air in a room where something terrible happened long ago. Several refused to finish the job. Those who did finish it reported dreams afterward. Dreams of children in old-fashioned clothes who stood at the foot of their beds and watched them with an expression not of anger, but of something more exhausting, the need to be seen. The remains found under the church, all 6, including those of the 2 unborn Whitman daughters, were given proper burial in a church 60 miles away. Pastor Phillips conducted the service. He could barely get through it. Ezekiel Morrison took his daughters away the morning after Thompson's confession. Rebecca seemed lighter. The darkness under her eyes had faded. Rachel held her father's hand and didn't speak for the first 12 miles. Then she said, "Papa, there's a community called Harrow's Bend, 6 days east of here." Ezekiel closed his eyes briefly. "I know," he said. "They need us," Rachel said. He kept walking. Pastor Phillips's final entry about the Morrison twins is dated November 21st, 1834, 3 days after they left. He wrote, "I do not know what they are. I have prayed for discernment and received only silence, which I have come to understand is an answer in itself. They are not demons. I have read extensively on the theology of possession, and what the twins demonstrate has none of the features. They are not simply gifted in the manner of some unusually perceptive children. I have known such children, and they are categorically different. What I believe, what I cannot prove, and will not preach publicly, for it would overturn doctrines I am not yet prepared to abandon, is this: they are a door, held permanently open by the violence of their birth, in a winter storm, in a room with a dying woman who had her own gifts and passed them forward in the only way that dying can pass anything forward. The dead speak through them. I do not know if the dead speak through them from heaven, or from somewhere in between, or from some state of existence that our theology has not yet found adequate language for. I know only that the voices they carry are real. The grief is real. The need for witness is real. And I know that Pine Hollow's dead, all 11 of the murdered travelers, all 6 of the Whitman family, even the 2 daughters, who never breathed, all of them, are quieter now, as if they have been heard, and hearing was what they needed. Not justice, not vengeance, simply to be known. I find I cannot decide if that is consoling or the most terrible thing I have ever understood. The files on the Pine Hollow investigation remain in the Kentucky State Archives. Judge Harrison's final report, 47 pages, meticulous, haunting in its conclusions, is available to researchers who know where to ask. His closing paragraph has been quoted in legal texts and theological journals, and in recent decades, in the stranger corners of the internet, where people collect evidence for things they don't have names for yet. He wrote, "This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability. While science cannot explain the source of the Morrison children's knowledge, the accuracy of their testimony cannot be disputed. I leave it to wiser minds than mine to determine what it means that the dead appear to retain not only memory but intention, that they wait, that they find, in the end, voices willing to carry their weight." The Morrison twins vanished from historical record sometime in the 1840s. Various accounts have them dying quietly of old age in Tennessee. Various other accounts have them alive in 1887, still traveling, still arriving in communities where the ground holds secrets and the silence has a particular quality, a held-breath quality, the quality of a room where people have agreed not to speak of something. In those accounts, they are still 9 years old. Make of that what you will. The Kentucky State Archives don't have a file on it. Some truths find their own way to the surface, others are still waiting.